The hallway at Royal Lodge stretches long and drafty, lined with the kind of history that makes a person feel impossibly small, where footsteps are meant to be felt rather than heard, and where the air itself seems to carry the permanent scent of beeswax and something far older, something that speaks of centuries of service and submission. In the winter of a year that felt much like any other, a woman stood in the center of that hallway, clutching a silver tray so tightly that her knuckles had turned the exact color of the marble beneath her feet. And in that moment, the invisibility that had protected her for so long was suddenly violently stripped away. She wasn't supposed to be noticed. That was the first and most sacred rule of the household, for to be the perfect servant was to be a ghost, efficient and silent and entirely invisible. But on this particular day, the prince had made certain she felt every ounce of her own insignificance. Prince Andrew did not raise his voice because he didn't need to, because there is a specific kind of coldness that emerges from a man who has spent 60 years being told that his whims are laws, his desires are commands, and his presence alone is enough to reshape the world around him. He stood there with his posture rigid, his eyes fixed not on her face but on a point somewhere just above her shoulder, speaking about trivial things, perhaps the curtains or the cushions. It hardly mattered, because what truly cut through the quiet of the house like a blade was the tone itself, that sharp serrated edge of entitlement that suggested her very presence was an inconvenience he was being forced to endure. He said something brief and dismissive, and then he simply turned his back and walked away, the heavy thud of his heels echoing against the wood, leaving her standing alone in the dim light of the hallway, with the tray still in her hands as she began to cry, not the loud, jagged sobbing of a public breakdown, but a quiet, rhythmic leaking of spirit, the sound of someone realizing that the person they served didn't see them as a human being at all, but as something far less, something barely worth acknowledging. Yet as the tears tracked down her face, something shifted deep within her. Something cold and clear began to take root, and she looked down at the tray, at the tea cooling in the pot, and then she looked at the closed door of the prince's study, and she understood something fundamental. While she was invisible to him, he was entirely visible to her. She saw the tantrums and the strange obsessive demands. She saw the secrets that settled in the corners of rooms like dust, and she realized he thought he was safe behind these walls, because he believed the people within them weren't real, weren't truly people at all, and he was profoundly, catastrophically wrong. To understand how a man could find himself standing in a hallway berating a member of his staff over something as minor as a domestic detail, one has to understand the world of Royal Lodge itself, this house of high hedges and long memories, this sanctuary for a man who had slowly seen the rest of the world turn its back on him. And by this point in his life, the headlines were already circling like predators. The names of older associates were being whispered in hallways far less grand than this one. The pressure was mounting from all directions, and in the public eye, Andrew was a figure of controversy, a man under a microscope, dissected and questioned and condemned. But inside the lodge, inside those walls that he had spent decades perfecting, he was still the master, still the prince who required 72 teddy bears to be arranged in a specific hierarchy on his bed every single night. And to the staff, these weren't just quirks or harmless eccentricities, they were the barometers of his mood, the indicators of whether he would be reasonable or capricious. And if a bear was an inch out of place, it wasn't just a mistake, it was an act of treason, a failure so profound it seemed to threaten the very structure of his carefully constructed universe. The woman in the hallway had spent years navigating these minefields with precision. She knew which floorboards creaked, and which ones could be trusted. She knew exactly how he liked his water, neither too cold nor too warm, but at some perfect temperature that lived only in his mind, and she had sacrificed her own time, her own family moments, her own opportunities for any kind of normal life to ensure that the prince's world remained exactly as he demanded it to be. She had been loyal, not out of love perhaps, but out of a deep-seated sense of duty that is common among those who work for the crown. Because you don't just take a job in a royal household, you take a vow of silence. You accept that your own needs are secondary, that your own dignity is negotiable, that you are there to serve and not to question. Tome. The morning of the hallway incident had started like any other, with the house quiet and still, the mist clinging to the great park outside like a protective blanket, and she had moved through the rooms with her usual precision, straightening frames and polishing silver until it gleamed. But there was a tension in the air that day, a restlessness that everyone could feel. There were phone calls being made behind closed doors. There were lawyers arriving and departing with grim expressions. There were meetings that spoke of pressure mounting from the outside world. And when a man of power feels his grip slipping on the world outside, he often tightens it on the world within. He becomes more demanding, more particular, more prone to outbursts over things that wouldn't normally matter at all. The confrontation itself had been sparked by something so trivial, it would have been laughable if it wasn't so cruel. Just a misplaced item, A door left slightly ajar, some small domestic failure, and he had found her in the hallway and unloaded a week's worth of frustration onto her shoulders. He had spoken to her as if she were a child, then as if she were a dog, and finally as if she were nothing at all. And when he finally walked away, leaving her there with her tears and her tray, he likely forgot her existence within 30 seconds. He went into his study, sat at his desk, and resumed his life as if nothing had happened. He didn't realize that in that hallway, he had just broken the one thing that kept his private world truly private, the loyalty of the invisible. Because once you strip away someone's invisibility and treat them with such contempt, you've already lost them. The aftermath of a moment like that doesn't happen all at once. It's a slow burn, a gradual transformation that unfolds over days and weeks. She went back to the kitchens and wiped her eyes, and her colleagues saw her, but they didn't ask because they didn't have to. They all understood what had happened. They had all felt that coldness at one point or another. They all lived with the unspoken understanding that their dignity was a small price to pay for their positions. But for this woman, something had changed fundamentally. The price had finally become too high. And over the next few days, she began to notice things differently. She noticed the way the prince spoke to his family. She noticed the gaps in his stories, the inconsistencies that had always been there but that she had learned not to see. She noticed the documents left out on tables, the visitors who came under the cover of evening, the whispered conversations behind closed doors. She wasn't looking for a payday. She wasn't motivated by greed or a desire for fame or attention. She was looking for a way to reclaim the humanity he had tried to strip from her in that hallway. And so she began to talk. Not to the tabloids, not at first, but to those who were already looking for the truth. To journalists and investigators who understood that the most damaging testimony often comes from those closest to the subject. And she provided the small domestic details that somehow build a larger and far more complete picture than any grand confession ever could. She described the atmosphere of the house, the temperament of the man, the way he operated when he thought no one was watching, the petty cruelties and the strange obsessions and the careful management of his image. It is a common mistake made by those born into power. They assume that the people who serve them are part of the architecture, are as fixed and immobile as the walls themselves. They believe that because a person is silent, they are also deaf and blind and incapable of understanding. But the woman in the hallway had seen everything. She knew the layout of his life better than he did. She knew his rhythms and his fears and his weaknesses. She knew where he was vulnerable and where he was desperately trying to maintain control. And when the time came for the world to demand answers from the prince, she was one of the many quiet voices that ensured those answers couldn't be avoided, that the narrative couldn't be controlled, that his version of reality no longer held sway over what people believed. There is a specific kind of damage that can't be repaired by a PR firm or a legal team. No matter how skilled they might be, it's the damage of 1,000 small revelations. It's the story of the teddy bears arranged in their perfect hierarchy. It's the story of the shouting matches over curtains and cushions. It's the story of a man who demanded absolute perfection from everyone around him, while his own life was falling into complete and utter disrepute. And each story on its own was perhaps a minor scandal, a small detail that spoke to eccentricity or privilege, but together they formed a narrative that the public couldn't look away from. They painted a portrait of a man who was profoundly out of touch with reality, a man who viewed himself as a sovereign of a world that no longer existed, if it ever existed at all. The maid's decision to speak was the first crack in the dam. Once one person breaks the silence itself becomes a burden for everyone else, becomes impossible to maintain, and other voices began to emerge from the shadows. Other former employees, emboldened by the realization that the prince's power was a hollow shell, started to share their own experiences, their own stories of humiliation and coldness, and the particular cruelty of being made to feel invisible. The reputation he had spent decades building, the image of the war hero, the favored son, the dignified royal, all of it began to dissolve. It wasn't destroyed by a single explosive document or a sudden confession. It was eroded slowly and relentlessly by the people he had spent years ignoring, by those he had treated as ghosts, by the very invisibility he had so carefully cultivated coming back to haunt him. One afternoon, months after the incident in the hallway, the prince sat in his study alone. The house was quieter now. There were fewer staff members moving through the corridors. The walls seemed to echo more loudly with emptiness. The lawyers were still there, but their expressions were no longer just grim. They were defeated. They had stopped believing they could contain this. And he looked out the window at the gardens of Royal Lodge, still beautiful, still perfectly maintained, still the seat of his authority and his heritage. And yet something fundamental had shifted. He was still a prince. He still lived in a palace. But the walls felt different. They no longer felt like a fortress. They felt like a cage. He had always believed that his status protected him, that his position rendered him essentially untouchable, that the deference he was shown was a reflection of his own inherent worth and value. He never realized that the deference was a choice made by others, a choice that could be withdrawn at any moment, that could evaporate like morning mist, the moment the person making that choice decided they no longer wished to make it. The Leichenstahl. He didn't think about the woman in the hallway. He probably wouldn't have recognized her if she walked into the room at that very moment. She was just a ghost who had failed at her job, just another member of the invisible staff. But she wasn't a ghost, she was the one who had seen the truth, who had witnessed what lay beneath the carefully constructed image, and she was working somewhere else, now a place where she didn't have to worry about the hierarchy of teddy bears, or the precise temperature of the tea, a place where her dignity was not negotiable, and her presence was acknowledged. She lived a life that was perhaps smaller in scale than her time at Royal Lodge, but far larger in dignity and autonomy and peace. She sometimes saw him on the news, saw the way he looked during that infamous interview, the way his eyes darted around searching for an escape, the way he struggled to find the right words, the way he seemed utterly baffled that people were no longer accepting his version of reality, that the magic of his position no longer worked. And she would watch for a moment, her face expressionless, and then she would turn the television off and go about her day, content in the knowledge that she had played her part in the reckoning. There is a quiet power in being the person who knows the secret. There is an even greater power in being the person who decides when that secret is no longer worth keeping, when silence has become complicity, and the prince had thought he was teaching her a lesson about her place in the world, had thought that by making her cry in that hallway, he was asserting his dominance. But he never understood the fundamental truth of the world he lived in, which is that it is a dangerous thing, a profoundly dangerous thing to treat the person who sees you at your worst as if they do not exist at all, as if they are not a real human being with agency and choice and the ability to speak. The reputation of Prince Andrew didn't die in a courtroom or a parliament building. It died in the hallways of his own home. It died because he forgot that even a ghost has a voice, and that once a ghost starts to speak, everyone stops to listen. All the noise and the chaos and the distraction stops, and people lean in to hear what the invisible person has finally decided to say. As the sun set over Royal Lodge, casting long skeletal shadows across the lawn, the house stood as it always had from the outside, looking like a bastion of unchanging tradition and enduring power. But inside, the air was different. The silence wasn't the silence of respect anymore, wasn't the reverent quiet of a household functioning in perfect service. It was the silence of an empty room, the silence of a man increasingly alone in his own home. The man who lived there was still surrounded by history, still surrounded by the trappings of his birthright and his position, but he was alone because the invisible people were gone, and they had taken his image with them. They had taken the narrative and rewritten it. They had taken the carefully constructed fiction of his life and replaced it with the messy, complicated truth. The hallway was empty now. No one stood there with a silver tray. No one stood there with shaking hands. The marble was cold and the light was dim, and the only sound was the wind rattling the frames of the windows, echoing through rooms that had once been filled with the quiet, efficient work of those who served. He had wanted a house of ghosts, a world where no one dared to speak or question or assert their own humanity. And in the end, that is exactly what he got. He got the empty house he had always demanded. And with it came the terrible silence of complete isolation.